Haolonggood seems to have an incredible superpower. It's not just their improved sculpting, paint applications, and low prices. I mean the way they know just which dinosaurs to give us. Obvious ones with few or no models made, those begging desperately for an update, or even those we never knew we wanted. Dinosaurs like Urhosaurus, Edmontonia, Dilophosaurus, Centrosaurus, and Pentaceratops. They've even given us a 1-35 Apatosaurus and Alamosaurus. Today, we're looking at a long-neglected ceratopsian, Chasmosaurus. Now you'd think that Chasmosaurus would get more attention. The first I learnt of it was in David Norman's encyclopedia. Just look at that frill. Then, Chasmosaurus is the namesake of one of the two main divisions of ceratopsians, the chasmosaurines. We already have a good, though unfortunately colored PLoS Centrosaurus, so a Chasmosaurus was just crying out to be made. Chasmosaurus means opening lizard, from the Greek chasma, meaning opening, gap, or abyss, and of course, sauros, meaning lizard. The openings refer to these fenestrae in the frill. And here, in its little glory, is the animal itself with that frill. This model is 13 centimeters or 5.1 inches. Chasmosaurus has been estimated to be 4.3 to 4.8 meters. For 1-35, this represents 4.6 meters or 15.1 feet, right smack in the middle. And here's my Wonder Artistic Models 1-35 humanoid. You can see that Chasmosaurus is actually a small ceratopsian. It looks even smaller because of the bend in the arms here, making it shorter than you might expect. Once again, Haolonggood offers two color variants, a brown and a green. Both have exactly the same pattern, and in general the colors are applied very smoothly. As for the pattern, it's not exactly stripes, so I'm happy about that. And both are painted very soothingly, and especially in the green, has a very calming feel to it. I do wish the patterns were different to avoid the cloned or the stenciled look. The pose is very lively. You can see that the hands and the feet all seem to be rather digitigrade, whether they're reaching, landing, or pushing off. I do feel that more contact in some of the supports will look more natural, but overall, it's just a very nice touch. And now for detail. Let's look at the brown first. Starting at the head, the first thing I notice is that delightfully, and especially from the side, the very long frill. Seeing this chasmosaurine characteristic on the namesake is so precious. As you'd expect, the head is replete with sculpted detail. In the face, around the eyes, which are painted in a rather soulful way and has lost the cartoony appearance that plagued the earlier offerings. I like the eye shadowing around the eye as well. Down to the nostril, and then the rostrum. In the mandible, you see almost an accent of larger scales on the inferolateral margin, very pleasing, and the detail in the predentary. And tracking back up, you see the nasal horns, noting that lovely detail from base to tip, painted very nicely. I do wish the keratin was picked out in a lighter color, making it easier to see. And in the frill, scalation abounds. At close range, it does appear a little rough. Given what I've seen them do, I think finer scales could have been introduced, but it's pleasing nonetheless. And for a quick idea of size, here's my guesstimate. the tessellated scales here, have a nice contrast here where it's, I want to say, imbricated almost. You can see the nice jugal detail. I also wish that the frill could have been less conservatively painted, making a better show of that potential billboard. The very nice and large P3 here, what looks like an ugly seam, or maybe a flashing. On the back side of it, you'll see some of these speckles, which are another nice detail. But the overall form is really just pleasing to look at, and I've really missed this frill in my little ceratopsian collection. And as for the body, it's as reconstructed as for the typical ceratopsian. NHMUK4948 gave us a first look at some postcranial remains of Chasmosaurus, as you can see in this getaway trike skeletal. It's usual to then fill in with other ceratopsians and arrive at a bioplan that tends to be very similar across different ceratopsians. Our Chasmosaurus today follows this general idea, with similar proportions, a compact torso and a short tail. Quick check of the hands show the two lateralmost toes nicely non-weight bearing, but still bearing claws that, being so dark, is easy to overlook if you mind them. And in detail then, we can see the nice texturing that Haolonggood has given it. And again, it does seem to follow rougher lines, seen in older models. We do have the skin from Chasmosaurus, showing large pentagonal or hexagonal scales evenly spaced apart, interspersed with smaller scales. And this idea is suggested here by these larger scales scattered among the general integument. And as for the color, it's overall very subdued. The introduction of white, but not as stripes, takes it away from the tired scheme we've seen in too many models. I really like how the colors just fade and segue into the black of the feet here. There's this midline row of scutes, with some accompanying ones down the sides. The brown is very soothing, and even though I'm really tired of browns in general, looked at individually, these models are always pleasant to look at. The movement creases and skin folds are once again done very nicely, without exaggeration. So much for the brown. And now the green. Overall, it's just so soothing and it's my favorite. In the head, you can see how nicely the black in the base of the horn and the beak is picked out against the lighter, more bone-colored keratin. I'm just really loving that deep green in the frill, and very nicely faded patterns. You see how the epiparietals and episquamosals are handled. Very nicely colored, just giving it that much more of a keratinous feel than we got in the brown. And look at that scalation, beautiful. Rough, but beautiful. And maybe it's my imagination, but the green is so soothing, you even forget the relatively rough detail. I absolutely love this color in dinosaurs, especially done well. I'd say that white on green is such a repetitive color blend in Haolonggood that there's a risk it will become the equivalent of PNSO's dark stripes and brown. But the green, for me, forgives a lot. I do hope for more different choices, for example the black in the recent Cosmoceratops, which I sadly lost in transit. And here you see that beautiful fade and segue of colors going down the arm into the hands. And also those feet, just as we saw in the brown. Just wonderful how everything comes into play and ties in together. So that's it for the model themselves. And now, some science. Ceratopsians are known for having an incredible array of frills, horns, and other ornamentations. It used to be they could differentiate genera more easily. As kids, we had Triceratops, Styracosaurus, and occasionally Monoclonius. Nowadays, with so many permutations, it can be hard to tell. It gets even trickier at the species level. Chasmosaurus has been an interesting story. It used to come in quite a few species. Campbell et al. In 2016 pruned things down to just two, Chasmosaurus 𝗨𝗂𝗧𝗂𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧 shape, the length-to-width ratios, ornamentations, the parietal embayments, and even features like nose or brow horns to try and match our model, Campbell et al. Nominated just one main differentiator: the angulation of the embayment. For Rucelli, the medial margin is moderately to deeply embayed, from 128 degrees all the way to 89 degrees, or almost right angles. And for Belli, the embayment is shallow, with an angle of not less than 136 degrees and even up to 180 degrees. In other words, a straight transverse parietal bar. If we accept this, we can take the easy way out and not speculate about the one, the other, or a chimera, but measure our model. And I measure mine at about 150 degrees, putting it into the Belli camp. Now, not to muddy the soup, but a quick word on Vagaceratops. Holmes et al. 2001 identified a new Chasmosaurus species, Chasmosaurus avinensis. Sampson et al. In their 2010 paper on Utaceratops and Cosmoceratops considered this to be a new genus, Vagaceratops avinensis. Diagnostic features included the straight transverse parietal bar and the recurving epiparietal and epiparietal squamosals. However, Campbell et al. In 2019 examined these two skulls we've already seen in the 2016 paper, in which they were classified under Belli, and based on these, they decided that Vagaceratops really should be Chasmosaurus avinensis as originally named. But these two skulls they aren't confident to assign to the same species, because of the significantly larger parietal fenestrae and the shorter epiparietals, and so reassign them to Chasmosaurus sp, So it's interesting that while useful enough to help them decide that 𝗥𝗲𝗳𝗂𝗧 should really be Chasmosaurus avinensis, the skulls themselves aren't avinensis. The upshot is that Chasmosaurus seems to potentially have 3 distinct species: Rousseli, belli, avinensis, and a potential 4th with the SP designation. Of course, I'm neglecting other proposals here. Now, regarding other differences we see, or might think we see, in other regions, we can actually be quite generous with ceratopsians. For example, we know that horn cores don't dictate the outward morphology of the horns in the living animal. Keratinization can result in a final shape quite different from the underlying bone core. A good example being in bovids. So you might have a result like this haunting Triceratops by Dr. Mark Witten. We also know that just on ontogeny, bone remodeling happens with age. Our horns can change shape, size, orientation, or even become resorbed. And here's such a proposed possibility in the brow horns in Chasmosaurus itself. And here is how distinct epoxipitals in Triceratops can get resorbed and fused into the frill perimeter as the animal ages. However, even this isn't reliable, because we also know from Brown et al. 2020 that even in a subadult, the timing and extent of these changes can vary. They describe a Styracosaurus with many signs that suggest that even nearing adult size, some features can be underdeveloped, such as the nasal horn core and the P3, P4, and P5 spikes, which are only a quarter of the size of that in the holotype, and much too small for their estimated age. In other words, the changing of these features have decoupled from the developing age, lending yet another complexity in using ornamentation as indicators. Now, Holmes et al. 2020 show that even within the same animal, there can be left-right asymmetry. This is another Styracosaurus skull, UAL-VP55900, and you can see how different each side looks. Now, this might be due to different growth patterns, anchor point differences, disease, or simply, as I suspect, an extra epiparietal tree. But you can imagine that if half of this was found, separately, there'd be very excited people scrambling to name a new genus. And in many finds, we actually have only one side of the animal, and it's common practice to reflect it and fill in the other side. So, asymmetries might be more common than previously assumed. So, Rubeosaurus here might actually be Styracosaurus. In the same year, Wilson et al. Do recognize that the Rubeosaurus type specimen is sufficiently different from Styracosaurus, but should be assigned to a different dinosaur, Stellosaurus. It seems like 2020 was the year of Styracosaurus, and for Rubeosaurus, not too hot. And finally, anagenesis means that different morphologies don't always mean diversity, but could be transitional morphospecies evolving down a lineage. A good paper to read is the Fowler and Fowler 2020 paper, suggesting just such a lineage from Pentaceratops to Anchiceratops, with first a deepening and then the closure of the parietal embayment. And speaking of Stellosaurus, in that same paper, Wilson et al. Suggest another possible anagenetic lineage from Styracosaurus to Stellosaurus, Aeneosaurus, Archaelosaurus, and Pachyrhinosaurus. So in general, all these spikes and bumps are not definitive, and even the experts have different views. And even though ceratopsians are my sometimes second favorite dinosaur group, it's really hard to keep up with all the papers and arguments. And taken together, there's a generous range of morphologies that aren't as defining as we once thought they were. If a dinosaur is known only from one specimen, I like my models to follow those features as closely as possible, but otherwise I'm a lot less pedantic than I used to be. Alright, some comparisons. Now first, let's compare the two color variants directly, and you can see which you prefer. Personally, I prefer the green. The brown is nice, as I've said, but there's an ineffable je ne sais quoi in the green that makes it that much more special. The head seems darker relative to the body in the brown, and you have less of those keratinous contrasts that I loved in the green. I really hope for different patterns as well, so if a collector buys two, they don't feel like stenciled clones. And here's their very beautiful Sinoceratops. You see here that the Chasmosaurus does seem to return a bit to the roughness of earlier models, compared to more recent fineness in skin textures. Now the Cosmoceratops I lost in transit, so I can't show you that, but here's their earlier Nasutoceratops. If you compare them, you see our new Chasmosaurus does indeed have more fineness now, so it's a little rough but not really that rough, if that's a concern. Unfortunately, the Centrosaurine namesake I can't show together because it's out for repainting. But for PNSO, another Centrosaurine, the Styracosaurus. Then back to the Chasmosaurines. Here's Triceratops, and the Torosaurus. Just looking at these three Chasmosaurines together brings a smile to my face. And finally, of course, our standard comparators, the Wilson T-Rex, and the Cameron T-Rex. So, that's it for the Haolonggood Chasmosaurus. Again, they really delivered. Besides all their selling points that I don't need to reiterate, it's wonderful how they're being open to feedback and not defensive to critique. I usually don't waste time speculating or wishlisting. But if anyone's listening, my personal wishlist for the ceratopsians would be Aeneosaurus, a nicely painted Centrosaurus, and Spiclipius, maybe a Diabloceratops. I know many of you have wanted a good Chasmosaurus, so let me know if this one meets your expectations. I'll see you in the next video.